In the gray dawn hours of February 8th, 1587, within the cold stone walls of Fotheringhay Castle, a small dog huddled beneath the crimson velvet skirts of its mistress as she knelt before the executioner's block. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was about to lose her head, literally, and with it would fall the curtain on one of history's most sophisticated intelligence operations. The little dog would be the only witness to survive what came next. As the executioner's axe rose and fell twice, missing its mark the first time and striking only the back of the Queen's skull, before the second blow nearly severed her head entirely, leaving just a strand of sinew that had to be cut with the blade like a carving knife. But this was no ordinary execution. This was the culmination of a shadow war that had raged across Europe for decades. A war fought not with armies and cannons, but with codes and ciphers, double agents and forged documents, intercepted letters and psychological manipulation. It was England's first systematic intelligence war, and it had been orchestrated by a brilliant and ruthless network of spymasters whose names would echo through the centuries. If you use these videos to fall asleep, subscribe so you don't miss any new ones. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the video and any suggestions you have for future ones. Francis Walsingham, the dark-browed Protestant zealot whom Elizabeth called her Moor. Thomas Philippus, the pockmarked linguistic genius who could crack any code. And John Dee, the mysterious scholar-magician who signed his letters to the Queen with 007. This is the story of how Protestant England, a tiny island nation on the periphery of Catholic Europe, developed the world's first modern intelligence service to survive an existential threat that came not just from foreign armies, but from an enemy far more insidious. An enemy that spoke the same language, lived in the same towns, and prayed in the same churches, yet plotted in secret to overthrow everything the English Protestant state represented. To understand the birth of English intelligence, one must first understand the world that Elizabeth I inherited when she ascended the throne in November 1558. A world literally on fire with religious warfare. Across the Channel, France was tearing itself apart in a series of brutal religious wars between Catholic and Protestant factions. In the Low Countries, Protestant rebels were fighting a desperate war of independence against their Spanish Catholic overlords. In Germany, the religious settlement of Augsburg was beginning to fray as Catholic and Protestant princes eyed each other with growing suspicion. Elizabeth's England found itself in perhaps the most precarious position of all. The new queen was not just Protestant. She was a bastard. Protestant in the eyes of Catholic Europe. Her legitimacy denied by Rome. Her very existence a living affront to papal authority. When Pope Pius V issued the bull Regnans in Excelsis in 1570, formally excommunicating Elizabeth and releasing her Catholic subjects from their allegiance to the crown, he effectively placed a target on the Queen's back. Any Catholic who killed the heretic Queen would be performing a holy act, blessed by God and rewarded in heaven. The implications were staggering. Unlike other European monarchs who faced external threats from foreign armies, Elizabeth confronted enemies within her own realm. English Catholics who viewed her as an illegitimate usurper, and Mary Stuart, the Catholic Queen of Scots, as the rightful monarch of England. These were not foreign spies who could be easily identified by their accents or customs, but English men and women who looked, sounded, and acted exactly like loyal subjects until the moment they drew a dagger or lit a fuse. It was in this atmosphere of paranoia and religious hatred that Elizabeth's ministers began to understand a fundamental truth that would shape intelligence work for centuries to come. Information was power, and those who controlled the flow of information could control the fate of nations. In the paneled chambers of Whitehall Palace, where the morning light filtered through diamond-paned windows onto stacks of correspondence from across Europe, William Cecil worked with the methodical precision of a master craftsman building a cathedral. Later, Lord Burghley, Cecil possessed perhaps the most organized mind in 16th century England, and he understood that effective government required more than royal charisma or noble breeding. It required information, systematically gathered, carefully analyzed, and strategically deployed. Cecil's approach to intelligence reflected his fundamentally bureaucratic nature. Where other courtiers dealt in rumors and gossip, Cecil accumulated hard data, shipping manifests, tax records, population censuses, military muster rolls. His correspondence included not just ambassadors and spies, but merchants and scholars, ship captains and parish priests, all feeding him a steady stream of intelligence about everything from grain prices in Hamburg to troop movements in the Low Countries. But Cecil understood that raw information was worthless without analysis. In his private study, surrounded by maps and charts, genealogical tables and cipher keys, he developed what we would now recognize as the foundations of modern intelligence assessment. He taught his subordinates to look for patterns, to correlate seemingly unrelated pieces of information, to ask not just what was happening, but why it was happening, and what it might mean for English interests. If Cecil was the architect of English intelligence, Francis Walsingham was its master builder and its avenging angel. Appointed principal secretary in 1573, Walsingham brought to the position not just administrative skill, but the burning Protestant zeal of a man who had witnessed firsthand what Catholics would do to Protestants when given the chance. Walsingham's defining moment had come in August 1572, when he was serving as English ambassador to France. From the windows of the English embassy in Paris, he watched in horror as Catholic mobs, incited by the royal court, slaughtered thousands of Protestant Huguenots in the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day. The streets of Paris ran red with Protestant blood, and the Seine was choked with corpses. For 4 days, the killing continued, spreading from Paris to the provinces, claiming the lives of perhaps 70,000 French Protestants. The trauma of St. Bartholomew's Day shaped everything Walsingham did thereafter. Unlike Cecil, who approached intelligence work as an administrative necessity, Walsingham understood it as a holy war between the forces of Protestant truth and Catholic darkness. He returned to England, convinced that Catholics could never be trusted, that they would always choose their pope over their sovereign, and that Protestant England's survival depended on knowing their every move before they made it. Elizabeth herself found Walsingham somewhat unsettling. She nicknamed him her Moor for his dark complexion and severe demeanor, and occasionally complained about his rank Puritan zeal. Where Elizabeth was all charm and charisma, Walsingham was methodical and humorless. Where she delighted in keeping her options open, he preferred decisive action. Yet she recognized his value, for Walsingham possessed qualities that no other courtier could match: absolute loyalty, incorruptible honesty, and an almost supernatural ability to uncover Catholic plots before they could mature. With Elizabeth's grudging support and £2,000 annually in government funding, a fortune by 16th century standards, Walsingham set about creating what was essentially England's first professional intelligence service. He established spy networks in France, Scotland, the Low Countries, Spain, Italy, and even Turkey and North Africa. He recruited agents from every social class: impoverished university students who needed money, merchant adventurers seeking profitable information, Catholic exiles who could be turned or blackmailed, even common criminals who could trade intelligence for freedom. But Walsingham's true genius lay not in gathering information, but in manipulating it. He perfected the use of double agents, Catholics who appeared to serve Mary Stuart while actually reporting to him. He mastered the art of disinformation, feeding false intelligence to enemy agents to confuse and mislead their masters. Most importantly, he learned to be patient, allowing enemy plots to develop just enough to provide legal evidence while preventing them from actually succeeding. In a dimly lit chamber in Walsingham's London house, hunched over a desk covered with sheets of parchment filled with strange symbols and cryptic letters, worked perhaps the most important man in Elizabethan England that history has largely forgotten. Thomas Philippes was not a great lord or famous courtier. He was not even particularly impressive to look at. Mary, Queen of Scots, who once glimpsed him from her window at Chartley Castle, described him as a man of low stature, slender in every way, dark yellow-haired on the head, and clear yellow-bearded, eaten in the face with smallpox, of short sight, 30 years of age by appearance. But appearances deceived. Philippes was a linguistic genius who spoke French, Italian, Spanish, Latin, and German fluently. More importantly, he possessed an almost mystical ability to break codes and ciphers, to see patterns in seemingly random collections of symbols, to reconstruct the logic of encryption systems from fragmentary evidence. In an age when secure communication depended entirely on cipher systems, Philippes was perhaps the most dangerous man in Europe. The son of a London cloth merchant, Philippes had been educated at Trinity College, Cambridge, where his mathematical aptitude and linguistic gifts caught the attention of Francis Walsingham's recruiters. By 1578, still in his early 20s, he was working in Walsingham's household, gradually becoming the spymaster's most trusted lieutenant and England's first professional intelligence officer. Philippes approached code-breaking with the systematic method of a modern scientist. When presented with an encrypted message, he would first establish the frequency of each character, tentatively proposing values for those that appeared most often. When a particular approach hinted at absurdity, he would backtrack and try alternative substitutions. Gradually, he would identify the nulls, the cryptographic red herrings inserted to confuse code breakers, and put them to one side. Eventually, all that remained were the handful of code words, whose meaning could be guessed from context. But Philippes was more than just a code breaker. He was also a master forger, capable of imitating any handwriting style and reproducing the complex cipher systems used by enemy agents. This combination of skills made him uniquely dangerous, for he could not only read enemy communications, but also manipulate them, inserting false information or adding incriminating passages that would damn the intended recipients. Perhaps most remarkably of all, Philippes possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that enabled him to manipulate enemy agents without their knowledge. He could identify which Catholics might be turned, which double agents were genuine, and which were feeding him false information, and how to craft forged communications that would provoke precisely the response he desired. Working 16 hours a day in his cipher chamber, allowing himself only 4 hours for sleep and 2 for meals and recreation, Philippes gradually became the nerve center of English intelligence operations. Every intercepted letter passed through his hands. Every cipher system used by English enemies was eventually broken by his methods. Every major intelligence operation of the Elizabethan period bore his invisible fingerprints. While Philippes worked in the shadows of Walsingham's London house, another figure moved through the halls of power, with an altogether different kind of mystery surrounding him. John Dee was perhaps the most learned man in Elizabethan England, a Cambridge-educated mathematician, astronomer, cartographer, and philosopher, whose private library at Mortlake contained over 2,670 manuscripts, more books than Oxford and Cambridge universities combined. But Dee was also something else entirely, a practicing magician who claimed to converse with angels, an alchemist searching for the philosopher's stone, and quite possibly England's first secret agent. That he signed his most sensitive correspondence with Elizabeth using the cipher 007, the 2 zeros representing eyes for your eyes only, and the 7 symbolizing the alchemist's lucky number, has led many historians to identify him as the original inspiration for Ian Fleming's fictional secret agent. Dee's relationship with Elizabeth began in the most dramatic circumstances possible. In 1555, during the reign of the Catholic Queen Mary I, Dee was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London on charges of treason. His crime: Lady Elizabeth, then heir presumptive to the throne, had secretly commissioned him to cast horoscopes predicting the outcome of Queen Mary's pregnancy. If Mary produced a Catholic heir, Elizabeth's chances of inheriting the throne would vanish. If she did not, Elizabeth would become queen. The young Lady Elizabeth was already demonstrating the calculating intelligence that would make her one of England's greatest monarchs. By employing Dee to use his mathematical and astrological skills to predict Mary's reproductive future, she was essentially commissioning England's first intelligence assessment. That she was willing to risk Dee's life and potentially her own to obtain this information reveals just how seriously she took the business of gathering secret intelligence. Dee survived his imprisonment and emerged from the tower with his reputation intact and his relationship with the future Elizabeth I firmly established. When she became queen in 1558, one of her first acts was to consult Dee about the most auspicious date for her coronation. Throughout her reign, she would continue to rely on his advice, not just on matters of astrology and natural philosophy, but on issues of the highest state importance. Dee's extensive travels across Europe provided perfect cover for intelligence gathering. His reputation as a scholar gave him access to courts and universities throughout the continent, while his expertise in mathematics and navigation made him valuable to anyone planning maritime expeditions. During the crisis of the Spanish Armada, Dee provided crucial intelligence about weather patterns and wind conditions, correctly predicting that storms would damage the Spanish fleet and advising English commanders to conserve their forces until natural forces weakened the enemy. But Dee's most mysterious work involved his alleged conversations with angels, conducted through a series of spirit mediums, or scryers. Using elaborate rituals involving crystal balls, wax tablets inscribed with strange symbols, and complex incantations, Dee claimed to receive messages from celestial beings who revealed the secrets of the universe. Modern historians debate whether these sessions were genuine attempts at supernatural communication, elaborate frauds perpetrated by his scryers, or sophisticated psychological operations designed to extract information from foreign agents who attended his seances. The most scandalous episode in Dee's career occurred in 1587, when his scryer Edward Kelly claimed that the angels had commanded Dee and Kelly to share their wives. In what can only be described as a medieval wife-swapping arrangement, justified by celestial command, Dee agreed to sleep with Kelly's wife, while Kelly slept with Dee's much younger wife, Jane. 9 months later, Jane gave birth to a son who may or may not have been Kelly's child. Whether this bizarre episode represented Dee's genuine mystical beliefs, Kelly's elaborate seduction scheme, or some form of intelligence operation designed to compromise foreign agents, remains unclear. What is certain is that Dee's combination of genuine scholarly expertise, Mysterious magical practices and close relationship with Elizabeth I made him one of the most influential figures in Elizabethan England, and quite possibly one of its most effective intelligence assets. Throughout the 1570s and 1580s, Walsingham's intelligence network uncovered a seemingly endless series of Catholic plots against Elizabeth's life and throne. These were not the fantasies of religious fanatics, but sophisticated international conspiracies involving the highest levels of European power politics. Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in Europe, was actively funding attempts to overthrow Protestant England and replace Elizabeth with the Catholic Mary Stuart. The Pope was providing spiritual sanction and financial support for assassination attempts against the excommunicated Queen. French Catholic nobles were coordinating with Spanish agents to plan invasions that would restore England to the Catholic fold. The first major conspiracy that tested the emerging English intelligence system was the Ridolfi Plot of 1571. Roberto Ridolfi, an Italian banker operating from London, had developed an elaborate scheme to coordinate Spanish military support with English Catholic uprisings to overthrow Elizabeth and install Mary Stuart on the English throne. The plot involved some of the highest-ranking Catholic nobles in England, including Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, who had secretly married Mary by proxy and expected to rule as her consort. Walsingham's agents, still learning their craft, managed to uncover the conspiracy through a combination of intercepted correspondence and turned informants. The exposure of the Ridolfi plot led to the execution of Norfolk and several other conspirators. But more importantly, it demonstrated to Elizabeth's ministers the sophisticated nature of the threats they faced and the absolute necessity of systematic intelligence operations. The lesson was driven home even more forcefully by the Throckmorton Plot of 1583, which revealed the international scope of Catholic coordination against England. Francis Throckmorton, a young Catholic gentleman, was serving as the primary link between English Catholics and their Spanish and French supporters. His house contained detailed invasion plans, maps of suitable landing sites on the English coast, and lists of Catholic sympathizers who could be expected to rise in rebellion once foreign armies arrived. The plot was uncovered through what may have been Walsingham's greatest intelligence coup of the early 1580s, the recruitment of a spy within the French embassy in London. Modern historians believe this agent may have been the brilliant Italian philosopher Giordano Bruno, who was living in London at the time and had access to the highest levels of French diplomatic circles. Using the code name Henry Faggot, this mysterious figure provided Walsingham with detailed intelligence about French support for English Catholic conspiracies. When Walsingham's men searched Throckmorton's house, they found evidence of a conspiracy that dwarfed anything previously uncovered. The Spanish were planning a full-scale invasion of England with 50,000 troops, coordinated with simultaneous uprisings by English Catholics and supported by French naval forces. The Duke of Guise, the most powerful Catholic leader in France, had agreed to lead the invasion personally. Even the Pope had promised financial support and spiritual encouragement for the enterprise. Under torture in the Tower of London, Walsingham was not above using harsh persuasion when the security of Protestant England was at stake. Throckmorton revealed the full extent of the conspiracy. His confessions led to the expulsion of the Spanish ambassador, the severing of diplomatic relations with Spain, and the identification of dozens of English Catholics who were secretly supporting foreign invasion plans. But it was the final major Catholic conspiracy of Elizabeth's reign, the Babington Plot of 1586, that would provide Walsingham and Philippes with their greatest triumph and lead directly to the execution that would begin this account, the beheading of Mary Queen of Scots herself. In the summer of 1586, In a beer brewery in the Staffordshire countryside, the fate of two queens hung in the balance. Deep beneath Chartley Castle, where Mary Stuart had been imprisoned for 19 years, a secret postal system operated through the brewery's beer barrels. Letters were smuggled into the castle hidden in the bungs of beer casks, while outgoing correspondence was concealed in the same manner. To Mary and her supporters, this system represented their most secure method of communication with the outside world. What they did not know was that every letter passing through the beer barrel postal system was being intercepted, copied, deciphered, and analyzed by Thomas Philippes before being allowed to continue to its intended recipient. The entire communication network that Mary believed to be her lifeline to freedom was actually a trap, carefully constructed and patiently maintained by England's master intelligence officers. The conspiracy that would become known as the Babington Plot had begun innocuously enough in the Catholic underground of London. Anthony Babington was a young gentleman from Derbyshire who had served as a page in the household of the Earl of Shrewsbury during part of Mary's captivity. Handsome, charming, and utterly convinced of the righteousness of the Catholic cause, Babington had developed a romantic attachment to the imprisoned Scottish queen that bordered on obsession. By 1586, Babington had gathered around himself a group of like-minded young Catholic gentlemen who shared his belief that England's religious problems could only be solved by Elizabeth's death and Mary's accession to the throne. The group included John Ballard, a priest who had recently returned from France with promises of Spanish support, John Savage, who had sworn a personal oath to kill Elizabeth, and several other well-born Catholics who were prepared to risk their lives for their faith. What these earnest young conspirators did not realize was that their group had been penetrated from the very beginning by one of Walsingham's most effective double agents. Gilbert Gifford was a young Catholic who had been studying for the priesthood at the English seminary in Rheims when he was arrested by Walsingham's agents. Faced with the choice between execution and cooperation, Gifford chose to serve English interests while maintaining his Catholic credentials. It was Gifford who had established the beer barrel postal system, presenting it to Mary as a secure method of communication, while ensuring that every message passed through Philippes' cipher chamber. It was Gifford who had introduced Babington to Mary's French supporters, enabling the conspiracy to develop international dimensions. And it was Gifford who kept Walsingham informed of every development in the plot, while appearing to serve Mary's interests. The beauty of the operation lay in its patience. Rather than arresting the conspirators immediately, Walsingham and Philippes allowed the plot to develop naturally, providing just enough encouragement to keep it moving forward while ensuring that it never reached the point where Elizabeth's life was actually in danger. They wanted more than just another failed Catholic conspiracy. They wanted legal proof that Mary Stuart herself was actively participating in plans for Elizabeth's assassination. The crucial moment came in July 1586, when Babington wrote directly to Mary, outlining his plans in detail. His letter was a masterpiece of incriminating evidence, the affair being thus prepared, and forces in readiness both within and without the realm. Then shall it be time to set the 6 gentlemen to work, a clear reference to the 6 conspirators who had sworn to kill Elizabeth. Babington went on to request Mary's explicit approval for the assassination and her detailed instructions for the subsequent liberation of herself from captivity. In Philippes' cipher chamber, the cryptanalyst quickly decoded Babington's letter and forwarded a copy to Walsingham. Now came the crucial question: how would Mary respond? If she rejected the assassination plan, or merely ignored it, she might escape the charge of treason. But if she explicitly approved Elizabeth's murder, she would be signing her own death warrant. Mary's response, written on July 17th, 1586, exceeded Walsingham's wildest hopes. Not only did she approve the assassination plan, but she provided detailed advice about how it should be carried out and what steps should be taken afterward. "When all is ready, the 6 gentlemen must be set to work," she wrote, "and you will provide that on their design being accomplished, I may be myself rescued from this place." When Felipe's deciphered Mary's fatal letter, he was so excited by its contents that he drew a small gallows on the deciphered text before forwarding it to Walsingham. He knew that he had just obtained the evidence that would condemn Mary Stuart to death. But the master codebreaker was not finished. In a stroke of genius that demonstrated the sophisticated techniques that Elizabethan intelligence had developed, Felipe's forged a postscript to Mary's letter in her cipher and handwriting style. The forged edition asked Babington to provide more specific details about the identities of the 6 assassins and their exact plans. When Babington responded with a detailed list of the conspirators and their roles in the assassination plot, Felipe's had created an even more comprehensive record of the conspiracy. The trap was now complete. Walsingham had documentary evidence of Mary's complicity in plans for Elizabeth's assassination, detailed confessions from the English conspirators, and proof of international Catholic coordination. All that remained was to spring the trap at the optimal moment. The end, when it came, was swift and terrible. On August 11th, 1586, while riding near Chartley Castle, Mary was arrested and taken under guard to Tixall Hall. She never saw Chartley again. The same day, Walsingham's agents simultaneously arrested Babington and his fellow conspirators in London. The young Catholic gentlemen, who had dreamed of martyrdom for their faith, were about to discover the horrific reality of Tudor justice. Babington himself was captured in Harrow after a desperate flight from London. When news of his arrest reached the capital, church bells rang out across the city and bonfires blazed in celebration that another Catholic plot against the Queen had been foiled. But the celebrations would pale in comparison to the public spectacle that awaited the conspirators. Elizabeth and her council were determined that the Babington conspirators would serve as an example to any future Catholic plotters. The sentence was death by hanging, drawing, and quartering, the most brutal punishment in English law, reserved for traitors who had committed crimes against the crown. But even this savage penalty was to be carried out with particular cruelty. On September 20th, 1586, 7 of the conspirators, including Babington himself, were dragged on hurdles through the streets of London to a specially constructed scaffold at St. Giles in the Fields. Thousands of Londoners lined the route, jeering and throwing refuse at the condemned men. The atmosphere was that of a festival, with vendors selling food and drink to spectators who had come to witness the bloody entertainment. The executions that followed were designed to be as horrific as possible. Normally, traitors were hanged until dead before their bodies were mutilated. But on this day, Elizabeth had ordered that the men be cut down while still alive and conscious, so that they could watch their own disembowelment. One by one, the conspirators were strung up by the neck and left to swing until they were half dead. They were then cut down, still breathing, and made to watch as the executioner hacked off their genitals and dug out their intestines with a knife. As each man's entrails were cast into a burning brazier, his body was then dismembered and his severed head displayed above the gallows. John Ballard, arguably the plot's ringleader, was the first to suffer this agonizing death. Anthony Babington, who had watched Ballard's torment unflinchingly without even removing his hat, became the second victim. But when his turn came to face the executioner's knife, the young gentleman's composure cracked entirely. As he was pulled down, breathing from the gallows, he cried out again and again in Latin, Parce mihi Domine Jesu! Spare me, Lord Jesus! The contemporary historian William Camden, likely an eyewitness to these events, noted that the day's proceedings were not without some note of cruelty. The brutality was so extreme that Elizabeth herself was reportedly disturbed by accounts of the executions. When the remaining conspirators were executed the following day, they were allowed to hang until dead before their bodies were mutilated. A small mercy that did nothing to diminish the horrific impact of the spectacle. The heads and quartered remains of the Babington conspirators were distributed throughout London and displayed as a warning to any who might contemplate similar treason. For months, the grisly trophies served as a reminder of the fate that awaited those who plotted against Elizabeth's life. While the Babington conspirators met their grisly fate in London, Mary Queen of Scots faced her own reckoning at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire. The evidence that Felipe's had so carefully gathered was overwhelming, and even Mary's considerable charm and royal dignity could not save her from its implications. The trial, held in October 1586, was a carefully orchestrated legal proceeding designed to demonstrate that even anointed royalty was subject to English law when it came to treason. Mary was brought before a commission of 36 English nobles in the great chamber of Fotheringhay Castle, where an empty throne represented Elizabeth's presence, and Mary was seated in a subordinate position. The Scottish Queen defended herself with considerable skill and dignity. She protested that she had been denied the opportunity to review the evidence against her, that her papers had been seized, and that she had been denied access to legal counsel. Most importantly, she argued that as a foreign anointed queen, she had never been an English subject, and therefore could not be convicted of treason under English law. Look to your consciences, she told her judges, and remember that the theater of the whole world is wider than the kingdom of England. It was a powerful argument that touched on fundamental questions of sovereignty and international law that would resonate for centuries to come. But Mary's legal arguments could not overcome the devastating evidence that Felipe's had assembled. The intercepted correspondence clearly showed her explicit approval of plans for Elizabeth's assassination. Her own handwriting and cipher testified against her. The commission found her guilty on October 25th, with only one member, Lord Zouche, expressing any dissent. Even after her conviction, Mary's execution was delayed for months as Elizabeth wrestled with the implications of killing an anointed queen. The English Parliament pressed for Mary's immediate execution, but Elizabeth hesitated, knowing that the precedent of regicide could eventually threaten her own position. She was also concerned about the international reaction, particularly from France and Scotland. The pressure finally became irresistible in early 1587, as Walsingham's intelligence network reported new Catholic plots and Spanish invasion preparations. On February 1st, Elizabeth finally signed Mary's death warrant and entrusted it to William Davison, a Privy Councillor. 3 days later, 10 members of the Privy Council, summoned by Lord Burghley without Elizabeth's knowledge, decided to carry out the sentence immediately. On the evening of February 7th, 1587, Mary was informed that she would die the following morning. She spent her final hours in prayer, distributing her personal belongings to her loyal servants, and writing her will and a heartbreaking letter to her brother-in-law, the King of France. "Tonight, after dinner, I have been advised of my sentence," she wrote in French. "I am to be executed like a criminal at 8 in the morning. The Catholic faith and the assertion of my God-given right to the English crown are the two issues on which I am condemned, and yet I am not allowed to say that it is for the Catholic religion that I die. The execution itself, held in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle, became one of the most dramatic and disturbing events in British history. A scaffold had been erected and draped in black cloth, furnished with the executioner's block, a cushion for Mary to kneel upon, and stools for the witnessing earls. Approximately 300 spectators crowded into the hall to witness the death of a queen. Mary approached her final moments with remarkable composure and theatrical flair. When her servants helped her remove her black outer garments, they revealed a crimson velvet petticoat and bodice underneath, the liturgical color of Catholic martyrdom. She was making a final statement about the religious nature of her martyrdom. "I never had such grooms before," Mary said, with a smile, as the executioner and his assistant helped her disrobe, "nor ever put off my clothes before such a company." Even facing death, she retained her sardonic wit and royal dignity. The executioner and his assistant knelt before her and asked forgiveness, as was customary. "I forgive you with all my heart," Mary replied. "For now, I hope, you shall make an end of all my troubles." Mary was blindfolded with a white veil embroidered in gold and knelt before the block. Her final words, spoken in Latin, were, "In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum." "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." What followed was a scene of almost unimaginable horror and dark comedy. The executioner's first blow missed Mary's neck entirely, striking the back of her head and causing her to groan quietly, "Sweet Jesus!" The second blow severed most of her neck, but left a strand of sinew that had to be cut through with the axe used like a carving knife. But the most disturbing moment came when the executioner lifted Mary's severed head to display it to the crowd, declaring, "God save the Queen." As he held the head aloft, Mary's auburn hair, which had been a wig, fell away, revealing very short gray hair and causing the head to tumble to the scaffold floor like a grotesque football. Witnesses reported that Mary's lips continued to move for 15 minutes after her head was severed. And in a final pathetic detail that somehow summarized the human cost of this great intelligence operation, Mary's small pet dog emerged from its hiding place among her blood-stained skirts, having witnessed the entire horrific spectacle. The dog was not the only creature traumatized by what it had witnessed that February morning. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots sent shockwaves across Europe and marked the definitive end of Catholic hopes for a peaceful restoration of England to the Roman faith. From now on, the conflict between Protestant England and Catholic Europe would be settled by war, not by conspiracy. The execution of Mary Stuart in February 1587 made war between England and Spain inevitable. Philip II of Spain, already incensed by years of English piracy against Spanish shipping and English support for Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, now had both a religious obligation and a personal motivation to launch a full-scale invasion of England. The Pope had promised to treat the enterprise as a holy crusade, providing both spiritual sanction and financial support. Philip began assembling the largest invasion fleet in history, determined to settle the Protestant question once and for all. But Philip had not reckoned with English intelligence or with the audacious Francis Drake. Even as the Spanish were gathering their invasion fleet in the ports of Lisbon and Cadiz, Walsingham's spy network was providing detailed intelligence about Spanish preparations. English agents in Spanish ports monitored shipbuilding activities, troop movements, and supply preparations. Merchants with business connections throughout the Mediterranean provided regular updates on Spanish resource gathering. More importantly, Walsingham's intelligence operations had identified a crucial vulnerability in Spanish preparations. The massive invasion fleet required enormous quantities of supplies: food, water, ammunition, spare sails, rope, and most critically, the wooden barrel staves and iron hoops needed to make the containers that would hold provisions and fresh water. Much of these supplies were being gathered at Cadiz, on Spain's Atlantic coast. It was this intelligence that led to one of the most daring and successful military operations of the 16th century, Drake's raid on Cadiz in April 1587. Elizabeth had originally intended to send Drake to attack Lisbon, where the main Spanish fleet was gathering. But Drake, acting on Walsingham's intelligence about supply concentrations at Cadiz, convinced the Queen to let him strike at the Spanish supply lines instead. The raid itself was a masterpiece of surprise and audacity. On the afternoon of April 29th, 1587, Drake appeared off Cadiz with a fleet of 25 ships. The Spanish were completely unprepared for such a bold attack. Drake sailed directly into the outer harbor, engaging and destroying the Spanish galleys sent out to meet him. The Spanish galleys, designed for Mediterranean warfare, were no match for Drake's heavily armed galleons. Each English ship carried more firepower than the entire Spanish naval presence in the harbor. Drake formed his 4 great ships in a line and sailed them across the bows of the Spanish galleys, each English vessel firing a full broadside as it passed. The Spanish admiral, Don Pedro de Acuña, fought bravely but was forced to retreat with his ships badly damaged. For the next 2 days, Drake's fleet systematically destroyed everything of military value in Cadiz harbor. 37 Spanish vessels were burned or captured, including several large ships destined for the invasion fleet. More importantly, Drake's men destroyed or captured enormous quantities of supplies. Barrel staves sufficient to make containers for 25,000 to 30,000 tons of provisions, according to Drake's own estimate. The destruction of these barrel staves would prove crucial to Spanish difficulties the following year. Barrels made from unseasoned wood, the only replacement material available, leaked badly and spoiled their contents. The Spanish Armada of 1588 would suffer constant problems with contaminated food and foul water, problems that could be traced directly to Drake's destruction of properly seasoned barrel staves at Cadiz. But perhaps Drake's most valuable capture was the great carrack San Felipe, bound for the East Indies. The ship's cargo included not just enormous wealth in silver and spices, but also detailed intelligence about Portuguese trading routes and commercial practices in Asia. This information would later be used as the foundation for England's own East India Company. When Drake departed Cadiz after 3 days of destruction, he left behind a scene of devastation and humiliation. The most powerful monarch in Europe had been unable to defend his own premier Atlantic port against an English privateer. Drake compounded the insult by publicly boasting that he had singed the King of Spain's beard. The raid had achieved far more than military damage. It had demonstrated that Spain was vulnerable, that English seamanship was superior, and that Protestant England would not wait passively for Catholic invasion. The psychological impact was enormous, encouraging Spain's enemies and dismaying her allies. Drake continued his attacks along the Spanish coast for several more weeks, capturing ships and destroying supplies wherever he found them. When he finally returned to England in June 1587, he brought with him not just treasure and prisoners, but also 2,900 barrels of Spanish sherry. This fortified wine, previously unknown in England, became so popular that it retained the name sack, derived from the Spanish word for the sacking of Cadiz, for generations. Even William Shakespeare celebrated the English love for this captured Spanish wine in his plays. The strategic impact of Drake's raid cannot be overstated. The Spanish invasion had to be postponed for an entire year while new ships were built and fresh supplies gathered. This delay gave England crucial time to prepare its defenses and organize its own fleet. When the Spanish Armada finally sailed in 1588, it would face a far better prepared England than would have been possible if the invasion had proceeded as originally planned. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, aided by English seamanship, Dutch flyboats, and most crucially, the Protestant wind that scattered Spanish ships along the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland, marked the definitive end of Spanish dreams of conquering England. Walsingham's intelligence network had provided the early warning and strategic intelligence that made English victory possible. The age of Catholic conspiracy was ending. The age of English maritime supremacy was about to begin. Behind the great political and military triumphs of Elizabethan intelligence lay a darker story of human costs and moral compromises that would haunt the participants for the rest of their lives. The men who had created England's first intelligence service discovered that the price of protecting Protestant England included the sacrifice of their own souls, fortunes, and ultimately their lives. Thomas Philippes, the brilliant cryptanalyst who had been central to every major intelligence success of the Elizabethan period, found himself increasingly isolated and impoverished as the political winds shifted. When Francis Walsingham died in April 1590, Philippes lost not just his patron, but his entire career. The Elizabethan intelligence system was not a government bureaucracy with job security and pension plans. It was a personal network held together by patronage relationships. Without Walsingham's protection, Philippes was left adrift. The death of Philippes' father that same year provided him with a small inheritance and the right to succeed to his father's position in the London Customs House. But Philippes was not meant for routine administrative work. He had spent more than a decade as England's master of secrets, breaking the codes of foreign powers and manipulating the fate of queens. Civilian employment seemed impossibly mundane after such work. Through his friendship with Francis Bacon, Philippes found new employment. In 1592, with Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, Elizabeth's new favorite. Essex hoped to impress the Queen by staging brilliant intelligence operations against English Catholic exiles in France and the Netherlands. Philippes, with his unmatched skills at infiltrating Catholic networks, seemed the perfect man to run such operations, but the political landscape had changed fundamentally since the 1580s. The execution of Mary Stuart and the defeat of the Spanish Armada had eliminated the most serious Catholic threats to Elizabeth's throne. The Queen and her senior ministers were less interested in aggressive intelligence operations and more concerned with diplomatic solutions to international problems. Essex's ambitions for intelligence triumphs increasingly put him at odds with the more cautious policies favored by the Cecil faction. When Essex fell from grace and was executed for treason in 1601, Philippes once again found himself without a patron. He managed to find employment with Robert Cecil, but the younger Cecil never trusted him as Walsingham had. The accession of James I in 1603, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, whose execution Philippes had orchestrated, further undermined his position. The final collapse came in 1605, when Philippes was found to have been conducting unauthorized intelligence operations related to the gunpowder plot. The same techniques that had worked so effectively in the 1580s, infiltrating enemy networks, using double agents, manipulating communications, were now viewed with suspicion by a government that preferred direct control over intelligence activities. Philippes was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. He would spend the rest of his life in and out of prison, either for political reasons or for debts to the crown that he could never pay. His eyesight, damaged by decades of close work on encrypted documents, failed him in his later years. His wife Mary, who had assisted him throughout their marriage, continued to support him as best she could, but there were no children to provide for their old age. In 1625, Felipe's wrote from his dog hole in prison, "Without comfort or means to relieve myself and those that depend upon me." The man who had once been the most powerful intelligence officer in Europe died in poverty and obscurity in 1626. History would largely forget his name, even as his methods and techniques became the foundation of modern intelligence services. Francis Walsingham's fate was only slightly better. Despite his crucial service to Elizabeth and Protestant England, he died in 1590 heavily in debt. The Queen, notorious for her parsimony, had never adequately compensated him for the personal expenses he had incurred in running England's intelligence operations. He had frequently paid agents from his own pocket and had mortgaged his estates to fund crucial operations. Elizabeth herself seemed to recognize the moral ambiguity of the intelligence work she had sanctioned. She valued Walsingham's effectiveness, but was never entirely comfortable with his methods. She praised his results while maintaining a careful distance from his operations. When he died, she reportedly said that she had lost her Moor, but she made no effort to pay his debts or provide for his widow. John Dee's later years were perhaps the most tragic of all. His association with the discredited Edward Kelly and his reputation for occult practices gradually undermined his standing at court. Elizabeth continued to consult him occasionally, but the close relationship of the early years of her reign never resumed. When James I became king in 1603, Dee found himself completely out of favor. The new king, influenced by Scottish Presbyterian attitudes toward magic and astrology, wanted nothing to do with Elizabeth's former conjurer. Dee spent his final years in poverty at his house in Mortlake, selling books from his great library to pay for food and fuel. The man who had once been consulted on matters of the highest state importance died in obscurity in 1608 or 1609. His library, once the finest private collection in England, was dispersed. His scientific instruments and magical apparatus were lost or destroyed. The human costs extended far beyond the intelligence professionals themselves. The Catholic communities of Elizabethan England lived under constant surveillance and suspicion. Families were divided between those who conformed outwardly to Protestantism and those who maintained their Catholic faith in secret. Priests who attempted to minister to English Catholics faced torture and execution. Catholic laypeople who provided them with shelter or support risked imprisonment and financial ruin. The stranger churches, Protestant refugee communities from the Netherlands, France, and other Catholic countries, found themselves both protected by and suspected by English authorities. While they were valued as fellow Protestants fleeing Catholic persecution, they were also monitored as potential security threats. Walsingham's agents maintained eyes everywhere to watch these communities in their native languages. Even loyal Protestant Englishmen found their privacy invaded and their correspondence monitored. The techniques developed to penetrate Catholic conspiracies were gradually extended to surveillance of all potentially suspicious activities. The Elizabethan intelligence system created precedents for government intrusion into private life that would influence debates about civil liberties for centuries to come. The death of Elizabeth I in 1603 marked the end of an era in more ways than one. With her died not just the Tudor dynasty, but also the immediate Catholic threat that had necessitated the creation of England's first intelligence service. The accession of James I, who sought to make peace with Catholic Europe, seemed to reduce the need for the aggressive intelligence operations that had characterized the Elizabethan period. Yet the techniques and methods developed by Walsingham, Philippes, and their colleagues had already begun to influence intelligence practices throughout Europe. Other nations, recognizing the effectiveness of systematic espionage, began developing their own intelligence services. The Spanish, French, and Dutch all created networks of agents and informants modeled on English practices. More importantly, the Elizabethan intelligence system had established fundamental principles that would shape government intelligence work for centuries to come. The integration of foreign and domestic intelligence under centralized control became the standard model for national security organizations. The use of double agents, controlled communications, and psychological operations became standard techniques. The systematic analysis of intercepted communications and the professional recruitment of intelligence personnel established precedents that influenced modern intelligence services. The technological innovations of Elizabethan cryptanalysis, particularly the frequency analysis and pattern recognition techniques pioneered by Philippes, provided foundations for modern code breaking. The systematic approach to cipher analysis developed in Walsingham's London house remained relevant through both world wars and into the computer age. Perhaps most significantly, Elizabethan intelligence established the principle that systematic information gathering constituted an essential government function in an environment of international competition and internal security threats. The integration of intelligence assessment into policymaking, the use of intelligence operations to achieve strategic objectives without military force, and the recognition that information could be as important as armies in determining the fate of nations. All of these concepts emerged from the Elizabethan experience. The moral and ethical questions raised by Elizabethan intelligence operations also presaged modern debates about the balance between security and liberty. The techniques used to penetrate Catholic conspiracies, surveillance of religious communities, interception of private correspondence, the use of torture to extract confessions, established precedents that would influence discussions about government power and individual rights for centuries. The Elizabethan system demonstrated both the potential and the perils of organized intelligence work. On one hand, it showed that professional intelligence services could protect democratic governments from existential threats, provide early warning of military attacks, and achieve strategic objectives through covert action. On the other hand, it revealed how easily intelligence techniques developed for foreign enemies could be turned against domestic populations, how intelligence operations could corrupt the officials who conducted them, and how the secrecy necessary for effective intelligence work could undermine democratic accountability. As we stand in the ruins of Fotheringhay Castle today, where only earthworks and foundations mark the site where Mary Stuart met her grisly end, it is difficult to imagine the drama that once unfolded here. The great hall where 300 witnesses watched a queen lose her head twice is gone. The scaffold draped in a black cloth has long since rotted away. Even the little dog that witnessed its mistress's execution has been dust for over 4 centuries. Yet the legacy of that February morning in 1587 and of the shadow war that led to it continues to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle. Every time a government agent intercepts a terrorist's email, every time a double agent provides intelligence about enemy plans, every time a cryptanalyst breaks an encrypted communication, they are using techniques that can be traced directly back to the cipher chambers and safe houses of Elizabethan England. The men and women who created England's first intelligence service believed they were fighting for the survival of Protestant England against the forces of Catholic darkness. They saw themselves as the guardians of religious truth and political freedom, protecting their queen and country from foreign invasion and domestic treachery. They were willing to sacrifice their fortunes, their reputations, and ultimately their lives for these beliefs. Whether they were heroes or villains depends largely on one's perspective. To Protestant England, Walsingham was a patriot who saved his country from Catholic tyranny. To English Catholics, he was a persecutor who destroyed innocent lives in the name of religious bigotry. To Mary Stuart's supporters, Felipe's was a manipulative schemer who manufactured evidence against an innocent queen. To Elizabeth's government, he was a brilliant analyst who exposed genuine threats to national security. What cannot be disputed is the effectiveness of their work. The Elizabethan intelligence system successfully identified and neutralized dozens of Catholic conspiracies. It provided crucial intelligence that enabled the defeat of the Spanish Armada. It created the legal evidence necessary to eliminate the most serious Catholic claimant to the English throne. Most importantly, it ensured the survival of Protestant England during the most dangerous period in its history. The cost of these achievements was enormous. Hundreds of English Catholics died on the scaffold or in prison. Countless families were destroyed by suspicion and betrayal. The men who created the intelligence system found their own lives consumed by the work they had chosen. The techniques they developed to protect English liberty were used to restrict the freedom of English Catholics. Perhaps the most sobering lesson of the Elizabethan intelligence story is how easily the methods used to protect democracy can be turned against democratic values themselves. The same techniques that saved Protestant England from Catholic conspiracy were later used to suppress political opposition and religious dissent. The same arguments about national security that justified surveillance of genuine foreign threats were used to rationalize monitoring of domestic critics. Yet the alternative, allowing genuine threats to develop unchecked, carried its own moral costs. Had Walsingham and his colleagues failed in their mission, Elizabeth might have been assassinated, Mary Stuart might have become Queen of England, and the Protestant Reformation in England might have been reversed. The religious wars that devastated France and Germany might have engulfed England as well. The maritime explorations that would make England a global power might never have occurred. The watchers of Elizabethan England faced the same fundamental dilemma that confronts intelligence services today: how to protect democratic societies from genuine threats without destroying the values that make those societies worth protecting. Their story offers no easy answers to this dilemma, but it provides crucial insights into both the potential and the perils of organized intelligence work. In the end, the shadow war of Elizabethan England was won, not just by the brilliance of individual spy masters or the effectiveness of particular techniques, but by the commitment of ordinary Englishmen and women to the idea that their country and their faith were worth defending. The intelligence professionals provided the tools and the methods, but the ultimate victory belonged to the people who supported them, funded them, and trusted them to use their terrible powers wisely. As we face the intelligence challenges of our own time, terrorism, cyber warfare, nuclear proliferation, and the eternal struggle between security and liberty, we would do well to remember the lessons of England's first intelligence war. The techniques may change, the technology may advance, the threats may evolve, but the fundamental questions remain the same. How much freedom are we willing to sacrifice for security? How much power are we willing to give to those who watch over us? And who, ultimately, watches the watchers themselves? The ghost of Thomas Philippe is hunched over his cipher table in a candlelit chamber 4 centuries ago, still whispers his answer across the centuries. Knowledge is never too dear. Whether we accept that answer, and at what cost, remains the defining question. of intelligence work in any age. In the shadows of history, the Watchers keep their eternal vigil, protecting us from threats we may never know existed, using methods we may never fully understand, at a price we may never be asked to pay. They are the inheritors of a tradition that began in the beer cellars of Chartley Castle and the cipher chambers of Elizabethan London. Their story is our story, and their dilemmas are our dilemmas, played out in an endless shadow war between those who would destroy our freedoms and those who would protect them, whatever the cost. The little dog that emerged from Mary Stuart's blood-stained skirts has been silent for 4 centuries now. But the questions raised by that February morning at Fotheringhay Castle continue to echo in every debate about government surveillance, in every discussion of national security, in every choice between safety and liberty. The shadow war that began with Elizabeth's accession continues today, fought by different warriors with different weapons, but driven by the same eternal struggle between order and chaos, security and freedom, the Watchers and the Watched. In that struggle, the Elizabethan spymasters were neither pure heroes nor complete villains, but something far more complex and human. People who made terrible choices in impossible circumstances, who sacrificed much to preserve what they valued most, and who left behind a legacy that continues to shape our world in ways both profound and troubling. Their shadow war is our inheritance, and their dilemmas are our own.